Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto and Sasuke became friends at a young age. Will Naruto's paranoia and mental instability draw Sasuke down into madness, or will Sasuke's own demons bring them both into the dark? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 7. Sasuke sat down at his seat as the class was called to order and sent a sideways glare at his hooded companion, who seated himself quietly and was still holding his head in pain. Getting Naruto to come for the genin exam had been like pulling teeth. They had gone back to dragging and holding onto doorways. And then Naruto had suddenly jumped up and rushed out of the house like the devil had been at his heels, leaving Sasuke puzzled and agitated. And it didn't help that Sakura kept staring at him and Naruto at intervals, with a stupid doe-eyed look. He really hadn't thought that they could be separated into different teams. He'd been so into training that nothing else seemed to exist. By the way Naruto had been going on, it was unlikely that he would come back to the academy if he was separated from Sasuke, and he didn't think any amount of verbal abuse would get him to go. "Alright," Iruka-sensei called above the excited murmur, "when I call your names, come up front and perform the task given to you." He then sat down next to Mizuki-sensei, and the exam began. It was easy enough. All they had to do was create a hench bunshin, which was so easy it was actually ridiculous. One by one they went through the students until his name was called, and he moved from his desk and stepped forward to perform the useless task, glancing back once to make sure Naruto wasn't having a nervous breakdown because Sasuke had left him. No, Naruto was still staring down at the desk, though it seemed that his headache was worse, judging by the fine tremble in his fingers that still cradled his head. Sasuke felt bad about that. He hadn't wanted to bash Naruto's head to knock him out, but the blonde had been too crazy for him to handle all the way home without one of the many ninja on duty noticing. Sasuke performed the Henshin Bunshin, and calmly returned to his seat just as Naruto's name was called. He sat down and turned to look at his companion. Naruto's eyes were turning red and glassy, as if he had been crying for hours, and he was shaking even more. It hit Sasuke that Naruto wasn't going to go up. He was going to fail the exam by not responding. "Uzumaki Naruto," Iruka-sensei called, and looked up to see both boys in their seats. "Get up there," Sasuke hissed as quietly as he could between clenched teeth, but Naruto's lips thinned and the boy shook his head minutely. Sasuke gripped his arm tightly, putting enough pressure for it to hurt, and growled, "If you don't go up there, I'll kill you later." The blood drained from the blonde's face and he looked up at him, red eyes wide, then slowly got up from the desk and quickly moved to the front. In the back of the class, Inyazuka Kiba watched as Uzumaki performed the jutsu perfectly, then turned to stare down at Uchiha. Inyazuka had excellent hearing, better than most, and he watched as Naruto returned to his seat next to Sasuke, his shoulders even more hunched than they already were, and felt pretty sorry for the kid. He couldn't for the life of him understand why Naruto hung around such a self-righteous bastard. Half the time he was relieved that he could manage staying in the same room as the Uchiha. It was no surprise that the bastard was such a jerk to Uzumaki. Everyone was let go early to celebrate their graduation with family and friends, but Sasuke rushed them home, angry and barely in control of his temper. "What were you thinking? All those years of training, and you were just going to throw it away? And for what? Because you're scared?" Naruto kept his head down, not replying. "Yeah, well, I guess that's no big surprise," Sasuke snapped as they passed through the compound gates. "Your middle name is probably Scared, or Frightened, or most likely Pathetic." Sasuke stomped into the house, then spun and pointed a finger at Naruto, who jumped back. "Well, I don't care how scared you are, you're going to show up tomorrow for team placement, and the day after, and so on, or so help me dash." He raised his hand, perhaps to hit him, but Naruto's face was beginning to crumble, and the rage drained from his body. He took a deep breath and went back outside for fresh air. Naruto did not follow. The next day did not start well. Naruto refused to eat breakfast, instead choosing to stare at nothing with a glassy-eyed disposition, and Sasuke was only grateful that Naruto didn't put up a fuss when they left for the academy. When they arrived, it was to the increased excitement of the passing academy students, and quite oddly, the occasional glare from Inyazuka Kiba, which was strange because he couldn't remember saying 2 words to the dog boy. As a matter of fact, he couldn't remember saying 2 words to anyone other than Naruto in a long time. When everyone settled, Iruka-sensei pulled out a list and cleared his throat. I'm going to first call out a team number, then 3 genin who will be in that team. Don't bother asking me to change the team later, it's not happening. Alright, for Team 5 dash. The names and teams were called out. Inyazuka Kiba, Hyuga Hinata, and Abu Ramesh Ino, were put together as Team 8, Yamanaka Ino, Narashika Maru, and Akimichi Chuji were Team 10. Ino looked downright enraged when this was announced, but the highlight of the event was that Haruno Sakura was put on Team 4, with 2 boys he wasn't familiar with. The girl looked absolutely crushed. For Team 7, Uchiha Sasuke, Uzumaki Naruto, and Yoshina Kairi, Sasuke gave an audible sigh of relief, and glanced at Naruto, whose lip was bleeding but the blonde was clearly relieved. All that drama for nothing. Then he frowned. Who was Yoshina Kairi? Hatake Kakashi stepped into the Uchiha main house and crinkled his nose at the strong cleanser scent that assaulted him and promised a maniacal headache. The Hokage moved to the living room and sat down with a sigh, eyes moving around the room. To Kakashi, it didn't seem like the residence of 2, practically unsupervised children but more like the house of an obsessive neat freak. He wandered through the rooms, stopping in what appeared to the boys' room, though there was only one bed perfectly made. He paused in the middle of the room and stared down at the pillow that sat in the corner. That's where Naruto resides, the Sandaime's voice came, and he glanced back at the older man. He doesn't sleep very often, so he apparently has no use for a bed. Was Kakashi's most intelligent reply. He'd read up on both boys, what Umino Iruka had written, the Hokage himself had written. It seems Uchiha Sasuke was the best thing to happen to Naruto, who was apparently a borderline schizophrenic, a condition that gave him pause as his eye fell on the newspapered windows. Before Sasuke, Naruto barely ate, slept, or left his apartment unless it was to get cleaning supplies. Sasuke had not only gotten him to eat, but to venture out and join the academy. Well, truthfully, as the Hokage admitted, Naruto had been forced to go. But he was a bit healthier, and was at the top of his class, and was around people. Iruka's report said something different though. Sasuke had completely shut down once he and Naruto returned to the academy. Both were extremely antisocial, seeming, and this was what Umino-san had written, as if they had retreated into their own little world. Kakashi was left feeling like he wasn't sure he could deal with both boys. Putting them on a team will remind them of the world and others, Sandaime assured, and he only sighed and shook his head. I'll try my best. And his best was all he could give. Yoshina Kairi was one of those goth girls, who wore too much eyeliner and black lipstick, and was apparently fond of fishnet anything. Her hair was cut in short spikes, and she looked at both boys with bland brown eyes and a few bruises on her face. She wasn't very popular with the other to-be kunoichi, and she sat a seat away from Naruto as they waited for their very late sensei. All the other children, and even the senseis had departed, leaving the 3 of them alone in the classroom. Sasuke leaned back in his seat and stared at the ceiling. He wasn't sure how much trouble Kairi would be, if she would hold them back, or inadvertently push Naruto back into his shell, but he was grateful that in the 3 hours in which they waited for their sensei, she had said nothing. This was good. If it had been Sakura, he would have likely been telling her to shut up. But Kairi only picked at her cuticles and looked at them from the corner of her eyes, and he noticed Naruto was doing the same thing to her, clearly unhappy with her presence so close to him even if there was a full empty seat between the two. The door slid open, and a silver-haired Jonin entered, one eye covered with his Hittite and the other open and disinterested. The rest of his face was covered from nose to neck in black cloth, and he wore standard ninja attire. You Team 7? He asked in a lackadaisical manner. Yes, Kairi mumbled. She had a rather pleasantly rough voice, and Sasuke thought it very bizarre that he had noticed this. Meet me on the roof, the Jonin replied, then poofed away. Sasuke sighed and pushed himself to his feet, heading for the door with Naruto at his heels. When the 3 arrived, the Jonin was sitting comfortably on a lounge chair, an orange book in his hand. They sat across from him on the ledge of the building and waited until the man put the book away and looked at them. So, I'm Hatake Kakashi, you can call me Kakashi-sensei. Let's start by you telling me what your likes and dislikes are, hopes, dreams, etc. etc. He pointed to Kairi first. I'm Yoshina Kairi. Hi, she introduced, giving Naruto and Sasuke a small half-hearted wave. I like writing and photography. I don't like to shout or argue. She blinked at Kakashi Sensei, who smiled cheerfully behind his mask, then pointed at Sasuke. I'm Uchiha Sasuke. I like very few things, I dislike many things, I have no hopes or dreams, but I have a certain ambition. His dark eyes seemed to smolder. To kill a certain man. I see, Kakashi muttered. He looked at Uzumaki, who didn't seem to care or notice Sasuke's words, for he was too busy staring at Kakashi's legs, and he resisted the urge to glance down at himself to see what the kid was staring at, but mostly because it wasn't an interested stare that the boy was giving, but an empty one, the kind devoid of thought, when your eyes just needed to rest on something. And what of you? He asked the blonde, but Uzumaki remained staring at his legs until Sasuke nudged his leg with his own, and the blonde looked up at his face with darting blue eyes. Still he said nothing. Naruto likes to read, Sasuke supplied for him with a shrug, and they lapsed into a momentary silence. Okay, Kakashi stood up. Tomorrow at 7, will be my test to truly see if you are worthy of the genin title. Come bring what you will, but don't eat breakfast, you're likely to throw it up. He gave a lazy wave before poofing away. Sasuke turned to Naruto. Let's go, we got some training to do. Naruto nodded, and both boys headed for the door. See you guys tomorrow, Kairi called faintly, and Sasuke glanced back and gave a small nod before they returned to the compound. When Kakashi showed up to the academy, he was surprised to see only Yoshina standing out in the field, picking at her cuticles and looking out of place. Where are Naruto and Sasuke? He asked, and the girl frowned up at him. You're all late. I thought we were supposed to show up at 7, she muttered, then turned as Sasuke and Naruto approached, the dark-haired boy looking peeved while the blonde simply looked miserable. Kakashi immediately noticed the katana strapped to their backs, and was curious to see that while Sasuke's was the usual hilt upward at his shoulder, Naruto's katana was hilt downward, at his hip and the tip at his shoulder. Interesting. Umino's reports spoke nothing of weapons beyond the shuriken and kunai, and he wondered if both boys could actually use the blades. They followed him out to training area 5, which was a wooden area, and stood around him as he produced a clock and set it down beside a tree. The object of this test is for you to capture these bells before that clock timer strikes 12, he shook the 2 small bells hanging from his hip. There are only 2 bells, as you can see, so that means one of you will be sent back to the academy. Sasuke's eyes narrowed, Kairi swallowed nervously, and Naruto looked glassy-eyed and indifferent, as if he didn't care about the outcome. And just to let you know, this has a 66% failure expectancy, so, I imagine you all will be failing. Feel free to attack me at any time with the intent to kill, because anything less will get you back at the academy. He pulled out his book. You may start, now. The timer pinged, and he watched as all 3 children disappeared into the surrounding trees. He could sense both boys nearby, and Kairi farther back. For 30 minutes both boys moved through the trees, apparently unsure of when or how to attack, and most likely wondering when he would do so. Then there was a rustle, and out leaped Sasuke, blade unsheathed and going straight for his head. Kakashi parried and pulled out his kunai, letting it clash with the ring against the blade, sparks flying as the steel glided against each other. There was a presence behind him and he leaped into the air, looking down to see Naruto's blade cut across where his legs had been. These boys could use those katana. He kicked Sasuke from him as he landed and punched Naruto in the chest, knocking both boys away. Sasuke landed lightly on his feet, crouching low with his katana pointed away from him, but Naruto staggered back, giving a wheeze and rubbing his chest. A whiff of sulfur came to him, and Kakashi looked down to see an exploding tag attached to his behind. He kawamarid away just as the tag exploded, showering splinters of wood everywhere and forcing the boys to cover their faces. Up in the trees, he created a Kage Bunshin and sent it after Kairi, who was hovering nervously in the trees, looking for a way into the fight. His Bunshin hopped down from the tree and approached her. The girl pulled out a kunai and threw it at him. The Bunshin slapped it away and leaped forward, throwing a punch, which the girl dodged, then blocking her kick. The girl put up a decent fight before she was knocked into a tree, giving out a cry before losing consciousness. Sasuke and Naruto, who had been in the small clearing, conferring with one another silently, looked up at the sound of her cry, then looked at each other. Sasuke's lips thinned and he pointed 2 fingers into the brush, and Kakashi watched as Naruto flitted away in that direction, surprisingly quick and quiet. These two were very interesting. Sasuke hadn't told Naruto to run toward Kairi's cry, but to go around it, lest he fall into traps. Taking this opportunity, Kakashi dropped from the canopy before Sasuke, and the boy immediately sheathed the blade, instead attacking him with taijutsu. He put his book away so he could engage the Uchiha properly and take stock of his skills. Sasuke had decent taijutsu training, a little better than average, and he was surprised when the boy shouted, "Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu." The Uchiha blew a billow of fire towards him, causing him to smile as he drew his hands together. "Doton, Shinjuryu Zanshuryu no Jutsu." He sank into the ground, moved under where Sasuke had landed, and pulled the boy into the earth until only his head remained above the earth. He emerged from the ground and studied the Uchiha, who looked both surprised and disgruntled before he poofed away into the trees and awaited Naruto's return, watching as Sasuke struggled to pull himself from the dirt but not able to move. Quite suddenly Naruto appeared from the copse of trees surrounding them, leaping over the brush and taking a few light steps into the clearing, katana in his right hand, before the blonde froze, his hood far back enough on his head to show his features properly. The boy's face was thin, with high cheekbones and no baby fat, with 3 whisker marks on each side of his almost hollow cheeks. His eyes were puffy and red-rimmed, with dark shadows underneath, and his face seemed frozen as he stared at the almost submerged Uchiha. Sasuke grunted, blushing, before asking gruffly, "Did you find Kairi?" Naruto opened his mouth, closed it, then asked in a cracked unused voice, "Are you dead?" Both Kakashi and Sasuke frowned. "Would I be talking to you if I was dead?" Sasuke snapped incredulously, and tried to struggle. "I'm stuck. He used some kind of earth jutsu on me. Help me out." Naruto stood where he was for a moment, staring at the Uchiha before moving forward and crouching by his side. He dug his fingers into the earth and made a short, half-hearted attempt to dig Sasuke out before he gave up. "I don't know any Doton Jutsu sa-" Kakashi chose to make his move then, appearing behind the blonde. As if sensing him, Naruto unsheathed his blade, swinging it around and miraculously missing Sasuke's head, but Kakashi grabbed his wrist, fingers digging into the bone as he simultaneously grabbed Naruto's other arm and held it behind his back. The blonde's hand spasmed and released the katana at the same time the timer gave a ping of finality. All 3 said nothing, frozen in that state, until Naruto's head moved, and Kakashi noticed that the hood had fallen back and he could see all of Naruto's hair, which was a pale yellow, and strangely enough, layered in different lengths. A blue eye peered back up at him from under uneven bangs, and he realized he still had the blonde within his grip. He blinked down at the boy, staring into that one blue eye, and realized that Naruto was waiting for him to inflict pain. There was this level of expectancy about that gaze. He released the boy with a sigh, and watched as the blonde cradled his wrist, on his knees next to Sasuke's head. Both boys said nothing. Kairi sighed, stomach aching with hunger but knowing she would get nothing as she was tied to a wooden pole, and Kakashi Sensei had said she wasn't allowed to eat. No wonder he had asked them not to eat. How sinister. But she was grateful, because he had said he was going to give them a second chance before he had disappeared off. She glanced sideways at Uchiha Sasuke, who looked to be mulling over the entire battle, though she hadn't seen much of it at all. She'd never been particularly good at fighting, which was why she had joined the Ninja Academy in the first place to better herself. Something touched her leg, and she turned to see that Naruto was offering her his lunch, his hood hiding more than half of his face. "That's okay, I can handle it. I'm not that hungry." Naruto's hand didn't move, and she jumped as the ropes tying her to the pole loosened, and she turned to see Sasuke put his kunai away. "You might as well eat it, he sure won't." She carefully took the lunch from the blonde with a blush. "But Kakashi Sensei said that you guys weren't allowed to share with me." She nervously but hungrily dug into the meal as Naruto buried his hands into his sweater pockets, but not before she noticed the angry bruising around his right wrist. Without thinking, she reached out and grabbed Naruto's arm. "That looks bad," she said just as Naruto jerked his hand back from her and stuffed it back into his pocket, his face stiffening with disgust. "Sorry," she muttered in embarrassment just as a gust of sand blew toward them, and they froze as Kakashi Sensei appeared before them. He looked pissed. "You," he bellowed, and Sasuke and Kairi blanched at his expression. Naruto just stared down at his own knees. Pass. His face went from anger to cheerful mellowness. Kairi swallowed. "I think I peed myself." Sasuke sent her an amused look before looking back up at Kakashi-sensei. "How did we pass? We haven't done anything yet." Kakashi smiled at him. "Ninja who don't follow the rules are trash." His smile faded as he looked them in the eye, minus Naruto, who was still staring at his knees, but ninja who don't take care of their teammates are worse than trash. He beamed again. "So I'll see you all tomorrow at the bridge." He turned away with a wave. "I've got to go register you all. We'll start missions tomorrow." Sasuke got to his feet and dusted himself off. Naruto was already standing, and seemed anxious to leave. "Thanks for the food, Naruto. It was real nice of you. "No need to thank him," Sasuke cut in. He really wasn't going to eat that. He glanced at the box container of food, then nodded at Naruto. "Come on, we got training to do." Maybe we could train together," Kairi suggested, but the boys were either too far away to hear her, or had simply ignored her, which wouldn't have been much of a surprise. Most people did. Their first mission was cleaning someone's yard, which was full of leaves and weeds, and though they clearly had no desire to do something so menial, they shut their mouths and grit their teeth, and did the mission. Except for Naruto, who took to cleaning the yard with a fervor that startled Kairi and made Sasuke roll his eyes. The way Naruto went at those leaves, it was as if he'd been raking them for years, and he went at it with a single-mindedness that bordered on villainy. He was truly in his element. Most of the D-rank missions consisted of labor, picking up groceries for an old woman, delivering merchandise to a house, painting a fence. Naruto was real good at this, and other dull chore-like duties. Every other day, Kakashi-sensei would take them out to Training Area 4 and train with them. He was teaching her better taijutsu and some strength training, and what she learned she used against Sasuke and Naruto. Sasuke always kicked her butt, but Naruto was completely frustrating because it was clear it was all he had to stay within 2 feet of her. They managed some pretty lousy sparring, with Naruto mostly evading her every move. The only time she actually saw him in action was when he fought Sasuke, because he was also leery of Kakashi-sensei. He didn't seem to want to go anywhere near the man unless Sasuke took him aside and said what she imagined were some very unfriendly words, judging by the pallor of his skin by the time he approached Kakashi-sensei. But she was getting better, and Sasuke wasn't as mean as she thought he was, and Naruto, she imagined, was simply shy. Very shy. Extremely shy. Okay, maybe ridiculously shy, but there was still something about him. "How's that team of yours?" Sarutobi Asuma asked as they sat down for the evening, sake pouring into their cups. Yuhikurenai sighed and took a sip of her wine and rubbed the back of her neck. "They've got promise. Kiba's a rash one, and quick to action, but he's got strength and potential. I've no doubts about the Aburame's Shino will do quite well. It's little Hinata that worries me." "What's the matter with the Hyuga child?" Might Guy asked, pouring more sake into his cup with a shiny grin. Kurenai rolled her eyes and groaned. "Don't get me started on the Hyugas. I shouldn't have to say much, you have one." Guy grinned in reply. "How's yours, Asuma?" Asuma took a swig of his cigarette and gave a lazy smile. "They're as expected, you know." He waved his cigarette hand. "The whole Yamanaka Nara Kimika team. I think it'll work just as well as the previous one." He turned to the very quiet copycat ninja. "And what of you, Kakashi? How's your team?" Kakashi, who had been staring at the tabletop, frowned without looking up. "Quiet? Huh?" was Guy's confused reply. Kakashi looked up from the table into their interested faces. "I must have the quietest team in Konoha history. They don't converse with one another, they don't fight or argue, they just train and do the missions." Wow, Kurenai couldn't imagine that kind of silence, not with Kiba's big, boisterous mouth. And Asuma had more than a mouth with Ino and his team. And Sasuke and Naruto keep showing up late, every day. And that's apparently saying a lot, since you're never on time, Asuma commented. Kakashi sighed. "I can't believe I'm going to say this, but..." And here he almost flinched. "My team is lacking that, burning flame of youth. Of course. Guy all but shouted, and the other two ninja sent dark glares Kakashi's way. You must guide them towards the flame. For they are the ninja of tomorrow. They are the three groaned as Guy went on into his inspirational speech and downed their drinks quickly, and refilling their cups just as fast. Kakashi watched as both boys approached the section of the bridge in which both he and Kairi waited. He had been reading while she had been snapping shots of the water below with an expensive camera. Today there was no mission for the team, and he had an intent to find out why the boys were actually later than he was. It was just unnatural. Sasuke, he gestured for the boy to come forward, and he moved away from the others. Sasuke shoved his hands into his short pockets and waited for him to speak. Why are you guys so late all the time? Sasuke scowled up at him but didn't comment that he too was always late. Instead the boy sent him a speculative look, then shrugged. The routine's all screwed up, and we have to be here earlier than we're used to. Kakashi raised a brow and waited for the boy to elaborate. Sasuke sighed and rubbed his neck in frustration. Naruto works on routines, you know, do the same thing every day. At the same time, he looked up at the Jonin, and Kakashi nodded in understanding. I guess he feels comfortable knowing what to expect. But now, every day is different and it's freaking him out. And that's why you both are late in the mornings? Shouldn't he be used to this routine by now? He glanced over to see Kairi talking to the hooded blonde, who just stared at her with his usual glassy eyes. Sasuke shrugged. Well, it's because he's spending more time cleaning in the morning. It's taking him longer because he's upset. Kakashi suddenly remembered how clean and spotless the Uchiha main house was. Naruto cleaned that whole place every morning? An idea came to him, and he gave a small smile. All right, let's go. They headed to training area 4, which was more of a field of sparse grass, and as they approached, he called Naruto over to him and had Sasuke and Kairi spar. Naruto stood in front of him and waited, eyes resting on his shoulder and not on his face. I'm going to show you a jutsu that will be most helpful to you. He made the seals as he spoke, Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. The shadow clone popped into existence next to Naruto and patted him on the shoulder, making the blonde jump and stare up at it in surprise. These shadow clones are solid, and are a great help in a fight, or in reconnaissance, or, I don't know, a helping hand when you're cleaning or something like that. He cancelled the jutsu and showed Naruto the seals again. Naruto tried the jutsu twice before he got it correct, and stood next to his clone, who looked just as miserable as its creator. Then the clone popped away and the blonde turned and looked directly at him, and to his complete surprise, the boy's lips turned up in a small smile. Thank you, the boy rasped, eyes showing his complete gratitude, and Kakashi was actually embarrassed as the boy scuttled away and showed Sasuke the jutsu. He expected the Uchiha to look jealous, or immediately want a jutsu of his own, but the boy merely sent him a grateful look, and while Naruto practiced making more than one bunshin, he continued to spar with Kairi. And Kakashi was surprised at how content he felt, in that moment. The next day both boys were there when he showed up, and Sasuke wasn't in a sour mood, and this continued on for the next week, until it wasn't they who were late, but Kairi. Except not only was she late, she didn't show up at all. I think she's sick, Sasuke commented, and Kakashi was inclined to agree. They decided to not take a mission, and instead they trained, and later went home. But Kairi didn't show up the next day either. Chapter 8. Sasuke and Naruto stood under the shade of the tree near the bridge, waiting for Kakashi Sensei to arrive. He was going to be very late, as was common and expected, but Naruto didn't mind waiting. The villagers that passed over the bridge did not often look at people who were not in motion, and since he truly did not want to be noticed, he was content to be as still as possible until he was forced otherwise. He smoothed the hood down over his eyes, and was surprised to feel the vitality running through his veins. Ever since Kakashi Sensei had shown him the Kage Bunshin, he'd had more energy to spare than he was used to. The Bunshin would help him clean the house every morning, and the work was done twice as fast without him worrying that the job wasn't being done right. After all, a part of him was doing the work. This resulted in Sasuke being in a better mood, which meant he was less likely to hiss threats at him, which he had been doing very often of late. It had left him unsure would he really kill him, or were they empty words. As he pondered this, his eyes drifted to the left, and jumped when he saw Kairi next to him. He hadn't heard her. He sidled a few steps away from her. She was too close, and then he got a good look at her face. It was swollen, mottled with purple and blue bruises, and one eye was so bad that it was nothing but a mass of swollen, damaged tissue. There was blood caked along the side of her face and running down a swollen neck. Her right eye seemed like it was the only one functioning, and it stared at him, empty and sad. Naruto swallowed and wrung his fingers in distress just as Kakashi-sensei popped up, his eyes running over them. Still no Kairi, and Sasuke shook his head in reply. Very well. We can't continue missions without her, so let's go over to her place and see what's keeping her. They moved toward the inner village, and Naruto hesitated, looking nervously as Kairi, whose swollen lips moved up in a slight smile. He rubbed his head, and quickly followed after the others, keeping his head low and darting wary glances at the villagers. Had that one looked too closely at him? Was there rage in that one's eyes? They stirred, and he felt them looking through his eyes, and they watered with the strain of their presence. Kakashi-sensei stopped them in front of a cottage that was trapped between a food mart and a private business, and to Naruto it looked out of place as Kakashi-sensei rapped on the wooden door. It was answered by an older woman with graying brown hair and swollen eyes from constant crying. Yes, she choked out, and Naruto saw Sasuke's shoulders tense at her despairing tone. He glanced at Kairi, whose one good eye was shedding tears as she stared up at the woman. I'm Kairi's sensei, and she hasn't shown up for missions, Kakashi-sensei addressed in a very careful tone as the woman broke down and buried her face in a shaking hand. We can't find her, the woman sobbed. She hasn't been home for 3 days. When was the last time you had seen her? He asked, voice more brisk. Sasuke's head was already swiveling about, but he gazed through her, not seeing that she was standing next to Naruto. She went to do missions, like she had been doing the last 2 months. Did you alert the authorities? The woman wiped her face with shaking hand and looked up at him. No, we didn't want to overreact. Kairi had a habit of going off on her own, but not for this long. I fear dash. Sasuke. Naruto. Kakashi-sensei cut in, and both boys looked up at him. Sweep the village. Ask anyone you know if they have seen her. In the meantime, I'm going to the tower to report her disappearance. Sasuke nodded and grabbed Naruto's arm, pulling them away from the cottage and into the street. All right, I go east, you go west. Search every place between here and the walls. Meet me at the bridge at sundown with or without Kairi. Sasuke was about to rush off, but he paused and looked back at him. And no one's going to kill you. They try, and you get rid of them. Understood. Naruto nodded and smoothed down his hood, watching in fear as Sasuke rushed away. He turned, glancing at the villagers, before moving eastward. Kairi followed along with a limp, eye focused on him. At sundown he returned to a frustrated Sasuke and Kakashi-sensei, both who seemed more concerned the longer her absence. Already several other ninja had been alerted, and Kakashi had already summoned a dog to sniff her out. But her scent had long faded, and it was too hard to pinpoint where she had gone. They returned to the compound with Sasuke in a dark mood, and Naruto feeling strangely confused. Why was Kairi following him? Did she not know she was dead? He noticed that once they passed through the gates of the compound, she stopped, watching them go in longingly, but not following. The next day, Sasuke was startled to see the members of Team 8 and 10 hanging out at the bridge. Hey Sasuke-kun! Ino called gleefully, and he moved to walk closer to Naruto. He glared at the girl when she approached, and her eyes fell on Naruto, who was staring at her, face pinched. She scowled and moved away as Kiba and Shikamaru approached. We got a mission to find your missing teammate, Kiba informed them, brown eyes full of excitement warring with sympathy. This sucks balls though. What do you think happened to her? Sasuke felt rage pass through him. If I knew that in Inuzuka, we wouldn't need your help searching for her, he snapped, and ignored Akamaru's growling, though upon ignoring it noticed that Akamaru wasn't growling at him, but at Naruto, who at first was looking at something, then turned his eyes toward the dog. The puppy's ears fell back against its small skull and it gave a small whimper before flopping itself on Inuzuka's head. The dog boy frowned and sent Naruto a curious look, but the blonde was instead looking at the others before staring at the ground then alternately throwing odd looks at the area next to him. Sometimes he knew he would never understand what fully went on in Naruto's brain. All that night he had tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep because he was seeing his dead family all about him, with two new added faces, Kairi and Naruto, but Naruto remained on his pillow most of the night, reading, or whispering to himself, which was so much the norm that it bothered him that Naruto wasn't upset about Kairi's disappearance. They split up, digging through sections of the village in search of Yoshina Kairi, and with every empty lead, Sasuke felt dread course through him. He'd gotten along with Kairi. She wasn't a funning girl only concerned about looks or her future marital status, and she hadn't talked their ears off. She was a decent sparring partner, and he had thought that they had been lucky to get her, and not Sakura or Ino. She'd actually been cool. And now they couldn't find her. Naruto stood at the bridge, hood all the way down, and kept darting glances at Kairi, who remained near him, staring at him waiting. It was obvious that she was waiting for him to do something. Or more like ask something. He had returned to the bridge soon after everyone had departed to search for Kairi. He looked at her again. What happened? He asked, and cringed when a passing villager looked down at him in puzzlement. He kept his head low until the man had moved on, then looked up at Kairi. The girl opened her mouth, and he could see several teeth missing. Dad got mad, she gurgled sadly, blood and rusted puffs spilled from her mouth. It was nothing new, but I cut him this time, and he... She shrugged and continued to stare at him. That you, Naruto? She asked suddenly. I barely recognize you, look so different. Her voice faded. Their laughter echoed through his head like a ringing bell, and his eyes fluttered in response, making him waver on his feet. Colors distorted, like water running through a pastel painting, and he coasted along with the sensation, forcing himself not to fight or struggle. He just let it run through him, the mesh of color and the strange sense of euphoria, like he was flow. Hey, a voice crashed through him like a ball through glass, and Naruto's head snapped forward to see one of the boys from Team 10, Shikamaru, gripping his arm, dark eyes full of concern. He blinked rapidly and tried to pull his arm away, but the villager had a good grip on him. You okay? He asked, and he quickly nodded in a hopes that the boy would release him. I don't think so, Shikamaru's voice was laced with doubt. Your eyes were rolled up into your head. Naruto quickly looked away, instead noticing that Kairi was staring across the river, her eye focused on one spot. She turned her head slowly and looked at him, then back at the spot, a far bank full of moss and high weeds. He pulled his arm from the villager's loosening grip and moved over to the railing, squinting to see what was there. What is it? Shikamaru asked, and joined him at the railing, trying to look where he was. Do you see something? Naruto nodded, even though he didn't, and moved down the bridge until it was no longer over the river, but over the bank, and dropped down over the side, landing on wet earth and weeds. Shikamaru followed after him, and together they trekked carefully along the bank, startling frog and mosquitoes as they passed, until the stench of death assaulted them, along with a host of flies, and they stopped before Kairi's body. She breathed Shikamaru, a hand flying over his nose as he stared down in disbelief at Team 7's third member. Her whole body was bloated gray with water, face almost unrecognizable. She wore the clothing he remembered from 4 days ago, though most of it was torn in random places. It seemed she had floated along in the river and had gotten tangled in some of the thicker roots that stretched out from the bank and often caught things. Shikamaru looked at the body, then at Naruto, who was standing even closer to her, seeming unaware of the smell or the cloud of flies buzzing around them and on the body. His face was empty, not the, this is too shocking for proper emotion, but a more like, I'm only mildly disturbed, empty. He watched as the blonde lifted his hooded head and looked to his right, then back down at the body. I'll go find one of our senseis, Shikamaru offered, the blonde nodded, not looking away from the body. He was grateful to go, if only to get away from the smell and Uzumaki's apathy. As the villager left, he turned to Kairi, who stared miserably at her body. Just when you think you'll live forever, she muttered. Nothing lasts forever, Naruto rasped, and they roared their amusement through him. They understood, they agreed, and they rejoiced in this knowledge, while he sank into the knowledge that this too, would be him one day dead and forgotten, by someone's hand. They started to arrive within 15 minutes of Shikamaru's departure, Kakashi Sensei and Sasuke, all of Team 8, and eventually, the rest of Team 10. They looked on in grim silence as the medic nins came to examine her body before lifting her into a black bag and carrying her away. Who could have done this? The red-eyed woman asked angrily, an arm resting on her own genin, as if to comfort herself that at least her genin were still alive and well. Kairi turned and looked at him, and Naruto cringed and sighed. Her father, he rasped, and every eye turned on him. He flinched and continued, she told me that he didn't like her. He didn't miss the suspicious look on Sasuke's pale face, but mostly he saw the rage in his sensei's eye, and the slight tremors running through his body. Really, Kakashi sensei's voice was like frozen steel, and all the genin looked up at him with wide eyes. Kakashi sensei turned on his heels and began to march up the bank, and they followed him all the way to the Yoshina cottage and watched as he banged on the door. The woman opened the door, looking even worse than yesterday, and gasped in alarm at all the people standing in her small yard. Where is your husband? Kakashi sensei snapped, and the woman's red blotchy face paled. I don't know. He's been out searching for KK-. A wave of killing intent blew over them and the woman choked. I tried to stop him. She shrieked, he didn't mean to he was drunk. A Chunin who had been posted at the house frowned and looked at Kakashi sensei. I'm guessing you found her, and at his stiff nod, Chunin sighed and stepped forward, taking hold of her arm. All right lady, let's go. We need to have a long talk. One you're not going to enjoy, I imagine. He pulled her from the doorway, and they all moved aside as he passed through. And don't you worry, we're going to find Mr. Yoshina, and have an even longer talk with him. The woman blubbered incoherently until she was out of sight. Naruto turned his head, spying Kairi standing there, watching her mother go. Then she turned and looked at him, undamaged eye leaking tears, lifted a hand and gave him a weak wave. Then she turned, walked away from them, and he watched as she slowly became transparent, and faded away. That night Sasuke was once again plagued by nightmares. This time instead of Kairi and Naruto dead along with his family, it was just Naruto, sitting in his own blood, staring at him with luminous blue eyes, blame and betrayal swimming amongst the tears. He woke with a start, sitting up and blinking rapidly, spotting Naruto in his corner. The blonde was reading something so intently, that he didn't stir when Sasuke sat up. There was a small night light in the socket, and Naruto had the book angled toward it. What are you reading? Sasuke asked, rubbing his eyes, and Naruto lifted his gaze and blinked at him. Strange with the gloom and the soft light, it almost seemed as if his eyes were glowing. Naruto lowered the book and slid it along the floor, until it was close enough for Sasuke to see. The Amateur's Guide to Horticulture, and Wowing Your Neighbors. Sasuke stared at the book, then looked at the blonde flatly. You're reading about plants, 2 in the morning. Naruto dragged the book back to him and continued to read. Sasuke threw his legs off the side of the bed and narrowed his eyes. Tell me Naruto, are you at least minutely upset that our teammate is dead? Everyone dies, Naruto whispered in reply, and Sasuke glared angrily at his dismissive words. You don't need to tell me that. I know. I just don't get why you don't seem to care. Naruto's eyes drifted up from the book and looked at him, and for once, there wasn't any fear or anxiety in them. No one's going to care when I die. Sasuke folded his arms and stared at the blonde until the boy's eyes drifted back to the stupid book about plants. He was wrong, he was so very wrong. He would care very much, but it would be a cold day in hell if he ever admitted such a thing. Instead he lay back in bed and turned his back to Naruto, tossing his covers over his body. Well, now we're one member short, he stated after some time, and the rustle of a turned page was the only response he received. Sasuke sighed and shut his eyes, but it was a while before he fell into an uneasy sleep, plagued with the dead. He completely missed Naruto's rocking, cradling his head and whispering to himself the book forgotten. Kakashi wandered through the cottage, sharp eye taking in the pictures on the walls, the little knickknacks lining the tables. All night he had been at Obito's grave, wallowing in his failure, his inability to watch over someone precious to him. That his genin would be murdered by her own father, his mouth filled with bile as he slipped into her room, and made a complete stop in the doorway, eye going wide as he took in the bedroom. From wall to ceiling were pictures, some blown up, some regular size, and as he took a careful step in, he stared incredulously at the object of Kairi's obvious obsession. There were hundreds of candid photos of Naruto, him seeming completely unaware that they had been taken. There were pictures of him bending down to pull weeds. He remembered that mission pictures of him staring at the ground, looking over at something, a picture of him and Sasuke sparring. All pictures of Naruto, in the same gray sweater, looking pale, weak, and drawn. He looked very ill in most of the shots, and he realized by the background, that these had been taken during Naruto's academy days. He turned in a complete circle, eyes taking it in, and noticed on a dresser a hooded doll with blonde hair peeking out. He picked up the doll and noticed that there were 3 lines drawn on each cheek, and that the wisps of blonde hair seemed too long, and as he touched it realized that the strands were real. His eyes fell on a book labeled Diary, no secrecy there, apparently, and he picked it up and opened a random page halfway through the book. I walked past Naruto today during lunch and I noticed that he smelled really good, like fresh laundry good. I'm not used to boys smelling so good. He flipped through another page. Naruto doesn't like Sakura or Ino, which is cool, because I hate both of them. It's so fitting that we would both hate the same things. He flipped closer to the ending. I was leaving the girls' bathroom today and I saw Sasuke dragging Naruto from the bathroom. Naruto was bloody and screaming that someone couldn't make him. Shikamaru was there too. I wonder what they were trying to make him do. I wanted to go to his rescue and get him away from Uchiha, but I was too scared. I went into the bathroom and saw chunks of Naruto's hair on the ground. He glanced in alarm at the blonde Naruto doll and flipped to the second to the last page. I hurt all over, but even with that, today was a good day. I still can't believe I'm on the same team as Naruto. And we met our new sensei today, and he was really cool. I thought he would give Naruto a hard time like that bastard Mizuki, but he wasn't mean to him at all. I hurt, but today was great. On the last page, the words were scribbled and smeared. Naruto doesn't like me. Daddy doesn't like me. No one likes me. Kakashi quickly shut the diary and placed it back on the desk, taking a deep breath and staring at the pictures on the walls and ceiling. Just as he moved, his foot touched something, and he looked down to see a plastic-wrapped package with a small card taped to it. He bent down and picked it up, pushing open the card. Happy 10th birthday Naruto. Love. Kairi. Kakashi sighed and placed the present under his arm, quickly leaving the room and exiting the cottage. He was about to be late for her funeral, so he hopped onto the rooftops and headed for the funeral home. When he arrived, it was to see that Team 8 and 10 had arrived, and surprisingly Guy's team, and Umino Iruka, all decked in black. He stood next to Sasuke and Naruto. Both were very pale, and it seemed that Sasuke had dressed Naruto in his clothes, perhaps because Naruto didn't own any black. The service started, a coffin with Kairi's picture sitting on top, and it was cruelly, a very sunny day with a perfectly cool breeze. Out of the corner of his eye he surveyed Sasuke, taking in the shadows around his eyes, and the fine line in which his lips were pressed, suppressing the rage that swirled in his black eyes. His hands gripped the white lilies so hard that the stems had already bent. His gaze moved on to Naruto, who was not in a hood for once, and it was apparent that this upset the blonde very much, judging by the way his eyes darted around under his uneven bangs, and the unhappy droop of his lips. Once again Kakashi noticed his hair, and saw that it was actually approaching the middle of his back. But what had his attention was the fact that his hair was in different layers, and not the professional kind, but the pulling chunks of his hair out kind. Just then, and he wasn't sure what made him notice, but his eye fell on the pair of lilies Naruto held in one hand, and watched in silent shock as the bouncy white petals began to droop and crinkle, turning a rotting brown until they hung withered in his thin hand. Kakashi looked incredulously at Naruto's face, and at first the boy didn't seem to notice that the lilies had died in his hands, but then he glanced down at his flowers, taking in that they were in fact dead, then his gaze drifted away, as if flowers dying in his hands were a common occurrence. Kakashi was speechless. When the speech was over, they placed their flowers on her coffin, and he saw Sasuke frown at Naruto's dead flowers. Good, he wasn't the only one seeing things. As they left, Kakashi stopped both boys. Naruto, Kairi meant to give this to you, and he handed the package over to the boy. Naruto flipped the letter to read the inside, blinking at the words, before placing the package under his arm and smoothing down his bangs. What happens now? Sasuke asked, pulling his eyes away from the package and looking up at him. We can't take missions with just 2 members, so we'll have to wait for the Hokage to send us a replacement. Take the next few days off, and I'll notify you when we have a new member." Sasuke nodded, and both he and Naruto ambled away. Kakashi turned back to the service, and watched as the gravediggers began to gather their shovels. Naruto sat down in the grass, wiping his sweating brow with a small napkin from his pocket, and glanced at Nabeshin, who was sitting beside him, staring up into the night sky, dark eyes full of secret thoughts. Nabeshin," he whispered, and the Uchiha turned his gaze onto him. Where do you go when you die?" The Uchiha frowned and looked down at his hands. "Can't say, being that I never left." He gave a wan smile and looked down at him. "Truth be told, we thought Sasuke-chan had brought you to take us." Naruto lifted his head and blinked at Nabeshin, who flinched and averted his gaze. "Your eyes, they are like 2 beacons of red light. We thought you were death, finally come for our souls. But..." He shrugged and stared back up at the sky. "We haven't gone anywhere. It's like we're trapped." Naruto picked at the grass. "Do you think it's quiet?" Nabeshin shook his head and shrugged again. "Like I said, I don't know. It hasn't been very quiet so far." A glare came over his face. "They bitch and moan all day. Useless all of them." He thumped his katana in the grass in agitation. "Naruto," someone called, and Naruto turned to see Sasuke wandering around the houses in his pajamas, head twisting around, searching for him. "Naruto!" The Uchiha called, and there was a sense of desperation about this call. He knew that the Uchiha hadn't been sleeping well these last few days. Naruto got to his feet and walked from the training field, katana swinging at his side. Sasuke caught sight of him and rushed past a decapitated Uchiha, whom he had been standing next to. "Where have you been?" Sasuke demanded as he approached. "I've been looking all over for you." He paused as his eyes fell on his katana. "Were you training?" Naruto nodded. "Well, why didn't you wake me? We could be training together." And he turned back to retrieve his katana. Harano Sakura leaned back in her seat and closed the review booklet, which she had been going through the last 2 months ever since she had been sent back to the academy. She had insisted it wasn't her fault, that the boys had made her fail, and she even overheard the Jonin Sensei who had tested them say that she had potential, but she had been sent back anyway. She'd been resigned to reviewing everything over again and taking the test and hopefully get a better team this time. She had been hiding from Ino and any of the others she used to associate with, because she knew she wouldn't be able to bear the teasing she would get if they found out she wasn't a genin. The door slid open and Iruka-sensei entered, face solemn, and he gestured for her to meet him at his desk. Standing up, she picked up her finished booklet and rushed over to him. "Have a seat," he gestured to the one across from him, and she sat down, suddenly feeling nervous. Why was he so serious? "Well, I have good news for you, I guess," and he looked uncomfortable with his words. "A spot on a team has opened up, and the Hokage has given the okay for you to take that place." Sakura bounced in her seat, eyes shining with excitement and relief. "Finally! Who am I paired with?" Again Iruka-sensei looked uncomfortable. "Ukadash!" Sakura squealed and hopped up and down. The gods were surely smiling down upon her. Not only was she getting on a team, but she was getting on the same team as Sasuke-kun. Settled down, Iruka-sensei sent her an irritated look, and she sat back into her seat. "What happened to their third member?" she asked, and at this the man sighed. "She died," he stated, and Sakura felt herself pale. "So I imagine both boys are very upset. So please, don't make things difficult for them. Meet them on the rooftop here, at 7 tomorrow." Sakura nodded and stood up. Of course, she quickly headed for the door, and it was as she was exiting the academy grounds that his words hit her. "Both boys? Sasuke-kun and..." "Oh no," she breathed, and felt much of the excitement fade. Uzumaki Naruto. Chapter 9. Disclaimer, Naruto does not belong to Clear's Darkanvar. Chapter 9. Naruto stared down at the package and puzzled over the words written on the small card. "Happy 10th birthday Naruto." He bit his lip. What he couldn't understand was, what had been so happy about that birthday. He barely remembered it. His birthday happened during the fall festival. They spent most of the week tormenting him, and Sasuke had taken to tying him up. There was no happiness there never had been, and he couldn't understand why Kairi would write such a thing. His eyes narrowed. Unless, she had sent it to mock him, make fun of him, to remind him that his 10th birthday was nothing more than another year living in his own wretched existence. What's in there? Sasuke's voice made him jump, and he looked back at his roommate. Sasuke had been searching the whole compound for hidden scrolls that he believed his relatives might have hidden, and judging by the pale sheen of sweat that lay over his skin, the search had not been pleasant. But the dark-haired boy was good at pretending he wasn't bothered, and instead he stood there with calm eyes, and an empty face. Is that the present Kairi never gave you? He asked, his dark eyes falling on the package with interest. Naruto gave a small shrug. She mocks me, he muttered, and Sasuke frowned at him before picking up the package and tearing through the plastic. The contents revealed to be a black sweater, thinner of fabric and smaller than he usually wore, with a red swirl on the back. Sasuke tossed it to him, but he moved out of the way, and they both watched as it flopped to the wooden floor. Oh, that's real nice, Sasuke remarked, giving him a flat stare as he leaned down and picked up the sweater, shaking it. It's dirty, Naruto replied, moving away, lest the dust and filth get all over him. It's brand new, Naruto. Sasuke snapped, then tossed the sweater onto the bed. The girl's dead, for God's sake. The least you could do is wear the damn thing. And he stormed out of the room. Naruto eyed the sweater, then picked it up with his thumb and index finger, and quickly rushed toward the laundry room, but not before dodging into a closet when he spotted Sasuke's mother coming out of a room. By that evening, he had tentatively put the black sweater on, and had to swallow the bile that rose in his throat as he did so. Kakashi stepped through the gates of the compound and shuddered as the cool, almost dead-seeming wind snuck its way through his vest. He had recently reviewed Sakura's profile after 3 days of waiting for an academy student to qualify, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to go through the process of getting acquainted again. It was too soon, in his opinion, to introduce a new member 3 days after the previous one had passed, but he knew that Sasuke would be anxious to get back to training and missions, and Naruto, well, he wasn't sure what Naruto would feel about meeting someone new. But it was his duty to notify his team of changes, and this would be a big one. The only thing that he was hopeful about was Sakura's more social personality. Perhaps his team wouldn't be so antisocial anymore. He slipped through the door of the main house, nose crinkling at the sharp cleanser atmosphere, and walked toward the sound of soft plates clattering. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and watched as Sasuke polished off the rest of his meal, and Naruto sat across from him, sulking like a 5-year-old unhappy with the meal his mother had made him. Before him was what looked like a bowl of soup. Through it had something slightly thick and white floating in it. Every few seconds Sasuke would glance at Naruto with a glare, and in response the blonde would pick up his spoon and sip reluctantly at the soup. The very atmosphere felt heavy with a type of melancholy repetition. There was no talking, or joking, or any emotion between the two that might say that they enjoyed one another's company. He coughed to get their attention, and Sasuke immediately surged to his feet, hand slipping down and gripping the katana that had been leaning against his chair. His dark eyes were wide with surprise, then alarmed as he turned them to Naruto. The blonde was still in his seat, but he was shaking and gripping the spoon so tightly that it was cutting into his skin. The boy's eyes were fluttering widely under his lashes while they settled on him, and his skin turned an alarming shade of white. Go to the room, Naruto, Sasuke commanded, and within seconds the blonde was out of his chair and down the hall. Sasuke sighed, then glared at him. You can't come here. Naruto doesn't like it. You'll make him crazy. Kakashi stepped into the kitchen and peered at the bowl of soup, raising a brow in question. It's chicken broth with pieces of bread in it, Sasuke answered with a sigh, and picked up the bowl, pouring it into the sink. He cleared off the table silently, then looked up at him in question. We've got a new replacement team member, so let's meet at the top of the roof like the last time. He watched as Sasuke's face darkened at his words. We should be back to missions by the day after tomorrow. We'll spend tomorrow getting to know each other. Who's our new teammate? Paranoia. Fuck, Sasuke breathed in clear frustration, running a hand through his hair in agitation. Kakashi shook his head. Little boys shouldn't be using such language. This earned him a glare. I'm guessing you know her. She's useless, Sasuke snapped, and Naruto can't stand her. Ah, Kakashi ran a finger along the tabletop, peering at his dust-free finger. This is bad news for him then. The Uchiha scowled. I'm not telling him anything tonight or I'll never get him out of here tomorrow. His eyes narrowed. And don't come back here. If there's something you need to tell us, knock on the door. I can't let anyone in here. Naruto doesn't like it. Kakashi gave a wry smile and nodded, and as he turned to leave, he gestured to the windows. Why is there newspaper on the windows? Sasuke looked at the windows and shrugged. Don't know, don't care. Kakashi gave a wry smile and exited the home, glanced around at the gloom, felt a chill run through him, and wondered if he had passed through a ghost. This place sure felt like one more and more. Sakura was nervous. It was 10 in the morning and she had been on the roof of the academy since 7, which had been the time she was given. Now, her mind was running through all the scenarios in which might be happening, the worst of them being that her reunion with Sasuke was too good to be true, and it was all an elaborate prank on her. Though she couldn't imagine Iruka-sensei pulling such a thing. Another was that she must be going crazy, and somehow dreamt this all up, and was now having problems differentiating reality from fiction. Her brain was making her work up a sweat, and she was now tugging at her hair in anxiety. Just when she was about to leap up and run home, the door to the stairway opened, and out strolled Sasuke, looking absolutely handsome in his blue shirt and white knee-length shorts. Strapped to his back was a short-blade katana, something she had never seen at the academy. The very air about him possessed confidence and power, something he always had, and she resisted the urge to leap up and jump to his side. Just behind him was Uzumaki, in a black hoodie and grey pants, also with a katana strapped to him, and the moment her green eyes connected with his accusing blue ones, she felt dread as his pale face tightened, and he paused. Sasuke glanced back and murmured something to him, and the blonde turned those accusing eyes to him. Sasuke scowled and replied lowly, and then the two approached her. "Hi Sasuke-kun," she stuttered, blushing as he sat down near her. He frowned and nodded in her direction, then settled for staring at nothing. Next to him, Uzumaki had his head down, locks of blonde hair shielding his expression from view. Already she had decided how she would handle Naruto. She would be sweet, and kind, and compliment him during training. She'd even share her lunch with him, boys liked to eat, and soon he would have no excuse to not like her. And if he liked her, then Sasuke-kun would like her too. Sakura suppressed a smile. It was a simple plan, easy to follow, with maximum results. "I didn't know we were supposed to meet here at 10, she commented, and watched as Sasuke shrugged in reply. She leaned forward so she could see around Sasuke. "How are you this morning, Naruto?" The blonde didn't even look up. That was okay, eventually, he would cave. 15 minutes later, a gray-haired Jonin popped up onto the rooftop, wandering over like he had all the time in the world. His one revealed eye ran over the three of them as he leaned against the wall. "Okay, so I'm guessing we should introduce ourselves again, being that we have a new member. I'll start. I'm your sensei, Hatake Kakashi. I enjoy many things as much as dislike them, by dreams and ambitions. Well, you'll just have to discover them for yourself." He seemed to cut himself off and point at her. Sakura smiled weakly and swallowed. "I'm Haruno Sakura, and I like dash." She glanced at Sasuke, then quickly stopped what she was about to say. "My dream is to become a great kunoichi. My dislikes are..." She paused, her mind running though to Naruto, to many other things that bugged her that she was sure Sasuke cared not to hear. "Well, it doesn't matter," she waved her hand weakly, blushing when she noticed Sasuke was staring at her, his face stoic and empty. "All right. Go on Sasuke." Sakura turned to him and smiled. "I'm Uchiha Sasuke. I like training, anything to do with jutsu, and I hate useless people who hold us back." Sakura swallowed when his dark eyes paused on her for a second. She would never hold him back. In fact, she would encourage him to be the best every day. "My ambition is to kill a certain man and restore my clan." Sakura felt a chill run through her body. "Kill a man?" Kakashi-sensei nodded, apparently having heard this before, and looked at the third member. "What about you, Naruto? Wanna say something this time?" Wow, Naruto still ignored his senseis? She had been sure he would start to interact once he was out of the classroom, but apparently not. She sniffed in disdain. If she were his sensei, she would kick him off the team as a defective member. She leaned forward so she could see said blonde, and he was still staring down at the cement roof. She noticed a single finger tapping against his knee where his hands rested. There was silence as they seemed to wait to see if the hooded blonde would say anything. And then, quite suddenly, he spoke, and this was the first time she had heard him say anything. "I like Sasuke." She was surprised by the cool rasp of his voice, but more stunned by his words, though it appeared by the shocked look on Sasuke's face. He was more stunned than she. Even Kakashi-sensei looked a bit surprised. "I dislike." And here he paused, rubbing his palms against his knees, as if nervous, though he hadn't looked up once. "Everything. I have no dreams or ambitions." She watched Sasuke stare at his friend, his normally cold face still morphed in surprise. "That's..." Kakashi-sensei gave a slight frown. "Great, Naruto." Sasuke looked at the Jonin, opened his mouth to say something, but instead turned back to stare at Uzumaki. Sakura was starting to think this was weird. Of course Uzumaki liked Sasuke, he practically clung to him every day. They were always together, so why was Sasuke so surprised? Geez. The way Sasuke was reacting, one would think Naruto had confessed his undying love or something. Her eyes narrowed. He hadn't, right? She peered at the blonde, taking in his pale, bony features. No, his expression didn't scream embarrassment, elation, or any of those emotions involved in a confession. In fact, Naruto looked downright miserable, which was his usual expression. No, it hadn't been a confession. It was more likely that Naruto really didn't like anything or anyone, but felt like he had to say he liked something. So he had said he liked Sasuke, and that's all it was. "Tomorrow we get a Miss Dash. Can't we get one today?" Sasuke interrupted, and the Jonin sent him a thoughtful look. "I suppose, if you really want one." He watched as she nodded her head in enthusiasm. Finally. She was a real ninja, about to do a real mission. Kakashi-sensei straightened from his leaning position and headed for the stairway door. "Come on then," he gestured, and both she and Sasuke got to their feet immediately. Naruto was slower to his, and he trudged after them sullenly. They made their way to the Hokage's tower, where missions were being handed out. To Sakura's surprise, the one handing the missions was Iruka-sensei, who smiled when they approached his desk. "Sasuke, Sakura, Naruto, how are you all doing?" he asked with a pleasant yet concerned smile, his eyes running over Sasuke and Naruto. To her surprise, the corner of Sasuke's mouth turned up as he shrugged, hands buried in his pockets. Naruto glanced up from his inspection of the floor, but that was all the acknowledgement he gave. She greeted her old sensei and was pleased when they were handed a mission, though she felt it a bit ridiculous when they were told what it entailed. Catching the Fire Lord wife's cat. Wow. She could tell by the barely concealed frown on Sasuke's face that he too was annoyed. Naruto was still staring at the floor. When they headed into the forest, Kakashi-sensei split them, he with Sasuke, and to her horror, she with Naruto. They went in opposite directions, and she followed Naruto. He was as she remembered in the academy, quick, light, and silent as they moved through the foliage, searching for the feline. "Here kitty, kitty," she called at intervals, making cat meows in the hopes of attracting the animal. At one point, Naruto paused and looked back at her, the accusing eyes she hated so much in full mode. What? She stuttered, flushing, and feeling the heat of it in her ears. "You got a better idea." The hooded blonde continued to stare at her, and as she opened her mouth to snap at him, he turned from her and continued on. She scowled at his back. "Here kitty, kitty, kitty." For an hour they searched, and by then she had stopped calling for the stupid animal, so it was a relief when Sasuke's voice crackled through the headset, "We found him. Head back to the designated meeting area." Naruto abruptly turned and walked around her, heading back through the foliage, then stiffened so suddenly that she stumbled against his back, the sheathed katana hurting her chest. "Ow," she muttered and glared at Naruto, whose head drifted up and he seemed to be staring up into the canopy. "What is it?" asked, eyes darting up to take in the leaves and branches. "Did you see something?" She moved to the side so she could get a better look at his face, and stared at his pale blue eyes. The pupils seemed to stand out so sharply against the color, and they seemed unusually large. An expression came over his face. At first it was a strange look, one she could not decipher, and then his face turned dangerous. His eyes narrowed, his head lowered so he was staring at the ground, and a foot worried at the dirt. Sakura swallowed. "Hey, Naruto." She didn't know why she dared to ask this now, of all times, but Naruto's head was still staring at the dirt, foot digging into it. "How did your teammate die? Who was she?" "Yoshina Kaoru." "Kairi." Naruto's foot stopped moving, and his head drifted up, and the usual accusing eyes were upon her again. He smoothed his hood down, sending a nervous look up into the trees. "Beaten to death," he rasped, and she nodded grimly, ready to move on, but was alarmed when Naruto's mouth opened again, and more words came forth. Broken and twisted, rotting, and fading. She felt her face drain of blood as his eyes took on that weird look again and drifted up towards the canopy again. "The world is full of the dead," he mumbled. "Hey Naruto, where are you?" Sasuke's voice made both of them jump, and Naruto immediately moved off toward the meeting area. Sakura paused, sending nervous looks up into the trees before reluctantly following the hooded blonde. Why did Naruto have to be so creepy? They'd been racking up missions for a full month now, all D-rank. They did 3 to 4 of them a day, on his persistence, because he had heard Inuzuka bragging about how many missions Team 8 had done, and he wanted to top that. But what really got him pacing around the bedroom that evening was that Kiba had boasted about a C-rank mission they had finished, and the very idea that the others were experiencing actual ninja duties, almost drove him up the walls. So Sasuke had decided that the first thing tomorrow, he would demand a higher mission from Kakashi Sensei, and they would not leave the tower until they had won. He was sick of cleaning people's houses, or milking cows, or any of the lousy shit that they were coerced into doing. He wanted a real fight, a real battle, real duties. He and Naruto both needed this. And he supposed Sakura too. She was actually sort of taking everything seriously, and she didn't bug Naruto as much as he originally had thought she would. She still talked too much though. He stomped down the stairs and spotted Naruto in the kitchen, creating a bunshin, and he watched as the physical clone popped into existence. That one jutsu had made a world of a difference in the mornings. Things got done faster and more efficiently, Naruto had more energy and did better in their daily spars. He was very grateful that Kakashi Sensei had shown it to him. Naruto getting a new jutsu had spurred him on to finding more of his own. He had searched the compound several times, digging through houses, jumping at creaks and strange noises, all the while avoiding bloodstains and marks where someone had tried to put up a fight. The more he searched, the more he was reminded of that horrible day. Shaking his head to rid himself of the dark thoughts, he peered at his blonde companion. "How many bunshin can you create, Naruto?" The blonde looked up at him as the bunshin began to wipe the tabletop rather nervously. Naruto had the look he got when he was having one of his headaches, pinched, and barely lucid. "2, he rasped, and rubbed a hand against his forehead. Sasuke moved farther into the kitchen. "You've got decent chakra control, but you don't really try to pull on it, do you?" "Try," he suggested, and the blonde put his hands together to make the seals. "Pull all the chakra you have, and make as many as possible." Naruto's lips pursed. Sasuke felt the strong flow of his chakra, could even see it, a pale blue. "Kage bunshin no jutsu." 7 bunshin popped into existence, all of them looking alarmed. Then 3 more, and 5 more, until Sasuke had to back up to the kitchen door as they crowded into the kitchen. "Okay," he called, alarmed at the constant flow of chakra coming from the blonde, and that more bunshin began to appear, so that some of them had to move into the living rooms. "You can stop now," he all but shouted, because now he could see that something was wrong. Naruto's eyes were wide with terror, and he was practically hyperventilating. And then the color and feel of his chakra changed, going from pale blue to an angry purple, then a bloody red. The stench of blood filled the room, and a wave of pure killing intent crashed through him. Many of the clones cried out in terror and immediately dissipated, and Sasuke was physically pushed back. Was this the Kyuubi? Was his demon side finally showing? Too much. Naruto cried, his voice breaking in terror and what sounded like pain. Too much. He wailed, and Sasuke could barely see him through the raging torrent of demonic chakra. Naruto! He cried, and leaped forward, but the moment he touched the chakra, he was tossed back through the doorway and onto the stairs, breaking the wooden railings. He tumbled down a few steps, his head cracking against the edges until he rested at the bottom, gasping for air. Most of his body felt numb, and there was a constant high-pitched keening ringing in his ears. Where was that coming from? Pain blossomed all over his body and he groaned, turning over onto his side just as the keening abruptly stopped. His wandering eyes managed to focus, and he could see the living room from where he was, and Naruto. Was that Naruto? Yes, it was him, and he was hovering by the couch, blue eyes wide, shaking, and staring at something. Was there someone in the house? He knew Naruto hated people in the house. He opened his mouth to yell at Kakashi-sensei to leave, but warm liquid filled his mouth and he spit out blood. His mouth did hurt a lot. How had he gotten on the floor again? Hey Naruto, he slurred in confusion. What happened? Naruto's frightened eyes turned to him from the living room, and then he popped away, disappearing. Sasuke frowned and slowly sat up, feeling his ribs cry out in pain, and his leg, and his shoulder, and especially his head. He groaned and cradled his head, feeling faint, and then he noticed that he was at the bottom of the stairs, and that half of the railing was broken all over the staircase. He pushed a piece of wood off of him, and that was when he noticed that the table in the kitchen was smoking. And next to the table, was Naruto, lying on his back, rasping for air. Memory returned, and he staggered to his feet, almost crying out from the pain in his legs and chest, and he felt like vomiting, but he staggered over to his roommate and almost gasped at the sight of him. It looked like someone had punched him in the face, but instead of swelling, his face simply bruised, ugly purples, reds, and black blotches that surrounded his mouth and cheeks, trailed down his throat and under his shirt. Sasuke dropped down to his knees and turned Naruto onto his side, for it sounded like there was blood trapped in his throat. Sure enough, Naruto gave some very ugly coughs and blood sprinkled the linoleum. Some of the capillaries in his eyes had popped, and bloody tears streaked down his face. Damn it, Sasuke hissed, and wrapping an arm under Naruto, slowly and painfully pulled the blonde to his feet, but it was clear that he was barely conscious. Taking a deep, pain-filled breath, Sasuke took the task of dragging his friend up the stairs and into his room, where he placed him on the bed and dropped onto the floor in a bout of extreme exhaustion. Before he knew it, he was out. Sasuke! Someone was saying his name. Sasuke! He felt a chill run through him, and felt his brain struggle to wake him. The voice frightened him, terrified him actually, and he knew he had to open his eyes, knew he had to look and see who was calling him, but he didn't want to. He really didn't. Sasuke, and this time there was a warm whiff of blood that touched his face. Sasuke's eyes shot open and he gave a strangled cry deep in his throat. Naruto's face was inches from his, right side against the carpet. He was on his knees so that his butt was in the air, with his head pressed to the carpet, his arms laying at his sides limply. His blue eyes were wide, very wide, with blotches of broken capillaries within them, so most of the white was red and bleeding into his blue irises. His mouth was twisted up in the most maniacal grin Sasuke had ever seen, and was staring directly into his eyes. Sasuke wanted to jump away, but his body was too sluggish and unresponsive, and all he could do was stare back into those wide, unfamiliar eyes, as they stared into his. Blood trickled through the blonde's teeth as he continued to grin, continued to stare. Wake now, Sasuke? The voice didn't match the bruised face. The voice was too high and at the same time, too deep. There was too much madness and cruelty in that voice. He could smell the evil coming from its mouth. All he could do was lie there and give a weak nod against the carpet, feeling his brain slosh in his cranium, and he felt a wave of nausea rush through him. Naruto's head turned, face pressed into the carpet, head turning away, and the prone body gave a rather vicious shudder. Then Naruto's head turned back, and the wide eyes were gone, the grin had disappeared, and all that was left was the familiar boy he knew, looking frightened and in pain. His legs straightened out until he was lying flat on the carpet, and his blue eyes glazed over, blood still trickling from his mouth. Sasuke took a deep breath and slowly sat up, back rubbing against the bed, nausea roaring over him and causing his eyes to water. He knew this feeling. He had a concussion, and he had lost consciousness, which he knew was a no-no when having a concussion. Had Naruto or whatever that was, awakened him from a possible coma or death. He blinked at the blonde, taking his appearance in, noticing the ugly bruising on his arms, where most of his sweater had been ripped away. What day was it? Was it still the same day? How long had he been unconscious both times? Putting his arm on the bed for support, Sasuke slowly and painfully pulled himself to his feet. His whole body hurt. After standing up straight and taking a few deep breaths, hoping nothing was broken, he turned Naruto over and slowly pulled him back onto the bed that had blood smeared along the sheets. He pulled the kunai out from under his pillow and sliced away the rest of his gray sweater, and stared down at the deep bruising covering all of Naruto's chest, stomach, and arms. "What's this?" he croaked, and stared at the spiral tattoo marking that shone darkly on Naruto's bruised stomach. "Seal," Naruto gurgled, startling him, for he had thought the boy was unconscious. Naruto lifted a hand and flopped it down on his stomach. "Seal? Seal for what?" "The Kyuubi." Naruto shuddered at the name but gave a weak nod. Sasuke frowned. You mean it's inside of you?" Naruto nodded again. "You mean, you're not Kyuubi, it's been sealed inside of you?" Instead of a nod, Naruto's hands flew to his ears. "What?" he cried, his voice in literal tatters. "Why won't she stop screaming?" Naruto began to writhe on the bed. Make her stop, Sasuke." "What are you talking about?" Sasuke was starting to feel frantic, spinning about the room but seeing no one there, only making his headache and nausea worse. "Who are you talking about?" "No one is here." Naruto removed a hand from his ear and pointed to a picture on the wall before replacing his hand on his ear and giving a low, broken keen. Sasuke stared at the portrait. It was a family portrait, but he had cut Itachi out of it, leaving only his father and his mother with him. He stared at the picture, then looked down at the bloody blonde. He wanted to spit, wanted to punch him, scream at him that it wasn't funny, that how dare he insinuate. He stopped breathing. Naruto running from areas of the house, Naruto walking around empty spaces as if someone were there, Naruto staring at odd things, Naruto somehow knowing about Kairi's father when he knew the girl hadn't said anything about her home life, knew this because Naruto had always been with him, and he would have heard her, if she had said such. Naruto could see the dead? Sasuke blinked several times, letting this knowledge run through him, then looked down at the blonde, who had become very quiet, and saw that he had stopped writhing, instead staring emptily at the ceiling, body sporting a fine tremble. Naruto could see the dead, which meant he must see his mother and father. "Naruto." He leaned over and shook the blonde by his shoulders. "Where is she? Is she here? Is she in this room?" Naruto's head flopped about with each shake, but he didn't reply, eyes remaining empty. Sasuke shook him once more, before releasing him and dashing out of the room and into the hallway. "Mom!" he called, and rushed through every room, calling her name, and finding no evidence of her. Then he left the house and ran the streets of the Uchiha compound, calling out the names of aunts and cousins, uncles, nieces, and nephews. But no one answered. Pain and exhaustion finally overcame his adrenaline rush, and he slumped down onto a porch, and rested his aching head on his knees. This place was a tomb. He returned to find that Naruto was as he had left him, and he began to clean up his companion. Naruto didn't have any surface wounds, all of the bleeding was under the skin, and after he had cleaned him up, Naruto seemed to regain some life, just enough so that he could crawl into his corner and curl up into a ball, facing the wall. Then he turned to himself, and touched the tender and swollen parts of his body. Nothing felt broken, but he had 3 large bumps on the back and sides of his head. He had a few splinters stuck under his skin as well, and he carefully removed those too, all the while his mind whirled about what Naruto had told him. It was almost too much to handle. Naruto wasn't Kyuubi, the fox was sealed inside of him, making them 2 separate entities. That mean person he thought Naruto was always talking to when he whispered to himself, must in fact be the 9-tailed fox demon. He felt a chill run through him. And then, there was Naruto seeing dead people. Had he seen Kairi? Did he really see his mother? No, it couldn't be true. Then his own thoughts gave him pause. Maybe it was true, and that the reason he could see them was because the fox could see the dead. That made sense. But why hadn't Naruto said anything about it all this time? Because you wouldn't have believed him, his mind whispered to him, and he flushed with shame. Naruto wasn't a liar. Why would he lie about something so sensitive? He hadn't lied about the villagers being after him, and it had taken a brick through the window to get Sasuke to believe him. So, Naruto could see the dead. His eyes fell on his katana, which was leaning against a dresser, and he could not help the grin that grew on his face. Naruto could see the dead, talk to the dead, learn from the dead. Oh, the possibilities. Sasuke choked on his laughter before giving in, roaring out loud in his delight, missing the flinch that ran through Naruto's body. He laughed until his ribs told him to shut up, and he went down to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee, needing the caffeine to keep him from falling asleep. He never stopped grinning, though. Sakura wasn't surprised to hear her name called upon as she passed the flower shop, and even turned with a smile as she spotted Ino in the doorway. "Hey forward girl," Ino greeted smugly as Sakura approached, "haven't seen you in a while. How's that team of yours?" "Which one?" Sakura replied, enjoying the look of surprise and confusion that graced the blonde's face. "You have more than one?" she asked with a cocked brow, moving to stand behind the register, leaning forward in interest. "Nah," she waved her hand dismissively. "I was with these two losers that were so bad, they got sent back to the academy. I had to wait a few days, but then I got on," and she paused here, watching Ino's wide eyes, then gushed, "Sasuke-kun's team." She expected Ino to look pissed, jealous, and start to insult her about her looks, but Ino simply straightened from leaning on the counter and gave her an almost pitying look. "Wow, that must suck, huh?" the blonde said. "I mean, with what happened and all." The girl looked quite serious as she stared at her. Sakura shrugged. "Yeah, I heard that the other girl died from a beating, but we get along great," she assured hurriedly, watching Ino's face. The blonde actually looked worried. "What?" Ino sighed, and leaned against the counter, glancing at the one other customer browsing for chrysanthemums in the back. "You weren't there, you know, when she went missing, but we all got called out to look for her. My team, and teammate. We searched everywhere, but it was Uzumaki and Shikamaru who found her. She was on the bank, dead for days." Ino shuddered at the memory, her voice lowering enough that Sakura had unconsciously leaned forward to hear her. "The story was, her father killed her." Sakura gasped, and Ino nodded in reply. "But the creepiest thing was, that Uzumaki didn't even seem to care that she was dead. He just stood by her body like it was a dead frog or something." Sakura paled considerably. "Shikamaru was really weirded out, you know? I mean, what kind of guy doesn't care if his teammate is dead? You better watch out for him, Sakura. He's the kind of guy that won't go out of his way to help you in a fight. He's the kind who will watch you die and not care as long as you don't get in his way." Sakura straightened from leaning forward and stared at her ex-friend. Ino ran a strand of her blonde hair through her fingers, inspecting it before looking back at her. "And you watch out for Sasuke too. He wasn't exactly broken up either, and you know how weird he's gotten since Naruto showed up. You watch your back." Sakura's eyes roved over the store, taking in the beautiful flowers, the air teeming with floral life, her finger tapping against the counter. Then she looked back at the blonde. "Okay," she said, and calmly exited the shop. That's it for part 3. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.